Our guest this morning is the acclaimed political affairs journalist and author, Robert Kaplan. It is a pleasure to welcome him back to this podium. He will be discussing his latest book, which is a collection of essays written between 2001 and the present, entitled The Return of Marco Polo's World: War, Strategy, and American Interest in the 21st Century.
This is a collection of essays that deals with basically two things: the state of the world as it is on the ground, beyond the media headlines, and what America should do about it, and what the American role should be about it. And in talking about the state of the world, what I mean is, what are the processes that are going on right under our noses, and how the United States is reacting to them. What I'm going to confine my talk to this morning is essentially, will be in the spirit of the lead anchoring essay of this collection, The Return of Marco Polo's World. I use Marco Polo's journey as a geographical framing device for Eurasia today, and there's a reason for that. Because if you look at the route of Marco Polo's journey, you see the pathways of the Tang and Yuan dynasties of the medieval era in China, which is the period when Marco Polo traveled during the Yuan dynasty. And if you look at the pathways and the routes and the plans for China's Belt and Road Initiative, you see the Yuan dynasty. What China is doing with Belt and Road is very much in keeping with their own imperial tradition. And we'll get into that, because it's one of the main themes of this whole collection is that while empire may be a dirty word on college campuses, you cannot understand the processes going on in the world today without seriously and dispassionately looking at empire. And I don't mean the British and French and European ones, I mean the Indian, Chinese, Persian, Seljuk, Ottoman Empire. So let me get started. It's not true that technology has defeated geography. What's happened is something much more subtle and complex. It's that technology has shrunk geography and distilled geography so that the world is more anxious, more claustrophobic, more nervous, smaller than ever before. Every place interacts with each other as never before. The crisis zones in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Baltic Sea basin, Ukraine, the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, all have an ability now to affect each other that never existed before in history. We tend to think of interconnectivity as a positive thing. It connects markets, creates an enlightened global culture, etc. That's true. But in a geopolitical sense, interconnectivity is very destabilizing. And that's why, for instance, I was at Davos in January, and the markets were at their top peak. This was before the disruptions of the later part of January. And yet nobody was happy there, because everybody sensed that our world is more geopolitically fragile than it's ever been. They just couldn't explain why. What I'm trying to do here in this lead essay is explain why. Think of the world on a taut string. If you pluck one part of it, the whole network vibrates. And that's the world. Take the word Eurasia. As recently as 20 years ago, Eurasia meant nothing. It was too big to mean anything. From Portugal to Indonesia, too big. Portugal to Korea, too big. But what's happened, because of the way technology has been shrinking geography, we can now honestly talk about a cohering Eurasian system of rivalry, trade, development, and conflict that never existed before. So Eurasia as a word has a meaning that it never did before. And to give you an example of what I mean, let me take just two countries. Look at India and China. India and China are two radically different world civilizations that were separated by the high wall of the Himalayas and the Pamirs and the Karakorums that had mostly very little to do with each other throughout history. Yes, Buddhism spread from India to China in Middle Antiquity. And the Opium Wars united India and China in the same zone of conflict in the mid-19th century. But those were aberrations generally. India and China were very separate. But now look at today's world. India has an intercontinental ballistic missile system that targets cities in China. China has fighter jets on the Tibetan Plateau that can include the Indian subcontinent or parts of it in their arc of operations. You have Indian warships increasingly in the South China Sea. And you have Chinese warships, especially submarines, the most aggressive kind of warship all over the Indian Ocean. You have China building or helping to build, or at least helping to finance, state-of-the-art ports throughout the Indian Ocean, to the east of India, to the west of India, in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Gwadar in Pakistan, Bagamoyo in Tanzania, and the Chinese are building a 155-acre military base in Djibouti on the mouth of the Red Sea. China is in the process of building a commercial throughput seaborne empire as though it were the early stages of the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. That's China. India and China are now connected in a very new geography of rivalry that never existed before in history. So rather than defeat geography, technology has been building new kinds of geographies. And India and China are just one example that you can play out around the world in terms of how every crisis and zone is interacting with every other one. Think of China moving vertically south towards the Indian Ocean, building or helping to develop these ports that I spoke of. And think of India moving east and west along the Indian Ocean, competing with China for oil and natural gas fields in Iran, competing with China in Myanmar for influence because Myanmar has a long border with India. I remember some years ago, it's about 10 years ago now, the American diplomats were very perplexed, and one of them said to me, why is India, a democratic country, giving military aid to Myanmar, a brutally repressive military dictatorship? And I said to them, have you spoken to the Indians about this, the National Security Advisor? They don't, because of geography, they don't have the luxury to stand on moralistic ceremony. They have to engage with Myanmar or else China will make it a satellite. And America is simply too far away. So this is where you get India and China competing with each other. And where does China's imperial dream begin from? It begins in the South China Sea. American diplomats can talk hours on end to the Chinese and tell them, you should not be doing what you're doing in the South China Sea. And the Chinese will listen politely and rightly ignore these Americans. Because from the point of view of China's geography, China's history, and China's goals, China is doing exactly what it needs to be doing in the South China Sea. China is doing nothing different in the South China Sea, and this was told to me by Chinese military officers, than what the Americans did in the Greater Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century. The South China Sea is China's Caribbean, and the Chinese think of this consciously in this term. If you think about it, America moved into the Caribbean in a big way after it consolidated the dry land portion of temperate zone North America. The last battle of the Indian Wars was fought in 1890. By 1895, American foreign policy was focused on the Caribbean. In other words, conquer the dry land, then the big adjacent sea next to it. And because the Caribbean bordered not just Mexico and the Gulf Coast, but the northern fringe of South America where most people actually lived, strategic control of the Caribbean gave the United States effective strategic control of the whole hemisphere. And with control of the hemisphere, it was able to affect the balance of power in the other hemisphere. And that's what the two world wars and the Cold War were all about. It all began in the Caribbean. Now, for China in the South China Sea. China gets several things from the South China Sea. Parity with the US Navy, or even dominance over the US Navy, gives China greater access to the Pacific. It softens up Taiwan, because Taiwan is the northern cork in the bottle to the South China Sea. And it allows China unimpeded access, finally, to the Indian Ocean, which is the world's global energy interstate, because the oil and natural gas are on one end of the Indian Ocean, in the Arabian Peninsula, the Iranian Plateau, and the customers are at the other end. The great middle-class conurbations of coastal China, South Korea, and Japan, Singapore, and elsewhere. China is at war with the United States in the South China Sea. There's only one problem, that the Americans don't know it. That's because the Chinese conception of war is different than the Western conception of war. The Western conception of war is you shoot, you fight. The Chinese conception of war is win without ever having to fight. Because if you have to fight, that indicates that you've made a strategic miscalculation somewhere along the way. So what the Chinese are doing is hundreds of micro steps. Take an island atoll here, build a runway there, move an oil rig into disputed waters there. After there's complaints, pull the oil rig out, but take another atoll 6 months later. Just keep moving like that, and in a way that doesn't generate page one news, but which over time, 10 or 15 years, one day we'll all wake up to a different world in the South China Sea. And that, in fact, is what is happening. Because the Chinese are dead set against any conflict with the US Navy, because they know they will lose. They may not lose in 15 years at the rate they're going, but they'll lose now. And so it all starts with the Caribbean. But then you have to ask the question, why is China going to sea in the first place in such a big way, developing such a big navy in the South China Sea and the East China Sea? Because China does not have very much of a naval tradition. In the early 15th century, it's true, in the Ming Dynasty, under Treasure Fleet Admiral Cheng He, the Chinese sailed as far as the Horn of Africa. But that was an aberration. That was really not part of their tradition, and they withdrew the treasure fleets when they had trouble with the Mongols in the north central part of their country. China never went to sea because it never felt secure on land. And China has the luxury now to engage, to focus so heavily on the South and East China Seas and the Indian Ocean, precisely because they're more secure on land than they've ever been. And they're becoming more secure and more secure on land. Why is that? That's where we get into One Belt, One Road, or Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative does several things that nobody reports about in the newspapers. The first thing, it's a branding operation for what the Chinese have already built in terms of asphalt roads, railways, oil and gas pipelines across Central Asia to get at the gas from Turkmenistan, the oil from Kazakhstan, so that China is less dependent on the Strait of Malacca, which is narrow and vulnerable for oil deliveries. So it's a branding operation for what has already been accomplished, essentially. Second, these pathways across Central Asia link China with Iran. And Iran, with a population of 80 million, highly educated, fronting not just one hydrocarbon-rich region, the Persian Gulf, but two, the Caspian Sea, is the organizing principle of both the Middle East and Central Asia. And China is investing heavily in Iran. It's building railways in Iran. It's mining for minerals in Iran. The Chinese-Iranian relationship is becoming deeply organic. And China plus Iran is an unbeatable combination in Eurasia. And the state that loses out the most is Russia, because China is beating the pants off Russia in former Soviet, Russian lingua franca speaking Central Asia, and is poised to infiltrate into the Russian Far East, while Putin is obsessed with the West. I never bought the argument that Putin's a great strategist or tactician at all. All right, the other thing One Belt, One Road is, it's a way to deal with China's internal demons. And one of the biggest of those demons are the Muslim Turkic Uyghur minority in Western China. And this is a minority that is Muslim, that does not feel itself part of Han China. The Chinese are very worried about them. So what China does is what One Belt, One Road accomplishes is it deepens China's relationship with these other Turkic Muslim states to the west of the Uyghurs. So the Uyghurs can never use them as a rear base in any future imaginable insurgency. The second thing it does, because the Uyghurs live in Western China, One Belt, One Road is economically developing Western China. So the Uyghur standard of living can rise, and as a result, there may have less of an incentive to rebel in future years and decades. So One Belt, One Road does all of these things. Again, this is a process that's happening in front of our eyes. And at the same time, we have the Middle East. Let me talk a few minutes about the Middle East. Why has the Middle East been so tumultuous over the past quarter century, whatever time frame you want to use on it? It's because of a basic fact that goes unreported, that for the first time in modern history, the Middle East is in a post-imperial phase. The Ottoman Turkish Empire, which ruled from Algeria to Mesopotamia, is gone. When the Ottomans ruled, whether you were a Jew or an Arab, a Sunni or a Shia, you owed loyalty to the Turkish Sultan in Constantinople. That didn't solve every ethnic and group problem, but it certainly alleviated it. That's gone. The British and French imperial mandate systems, which provided order and stability in the Levant, principally Syria and Iraq, went away in the late 1940s. The American and Soviet Cold War systems in the Middle East, which Oxford historian John Darwin called imperial in all but name, essentially went away. The Soviet system went away in 1991. The Russians have come back, but in much more limited fashion than compared to what was Soviet influence in Damascus, Baghdad, and many other places. And in terms of American power, for a long list of reasons that we could spend all day talking about, has dissipated over the last 20 years. America is not what it was in the Middle East. And it's not only because of the Iraq War or Afghanistan. It's because the Middle East is no longer run uniformly by stable autocratic systems where there was only one phone number, one fax machine, one president with one or two advisors who you had to deal with in order to deal with a crisis. Now you have to lobby dozens of people in many places. And it's not impossible to do, it's just harder to do. And this is, so it's an irony. The very weakening of autocracy has also weakened American power in the region. And so the Middle East is left to its own devices. And the result of that is the rise and jockeying for position of regional hegemons. And Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and to a lesser extent, Egypt. Iran really has an advantage because it has of all of these places the greatest imperial tradition. If you look at a map of where Iran has influence from the eastern Mediterranean, Lebanon, all the way through central Afghanistan where the Iranian rial is the unofficial currency, you have a map essentially of most Persian-speaking empires going back to antiquity. You look at the map of the Achaemenids, the Sassanids, the Medes, the Parthians, you see exactly where Iran is influential today. The Ayatollahs are nothing but the latest incarnation of Persian imperialism in a way. And this is a reason why the Iranians are so brilliant at working with proxy armies, proxy militias, because the real day-to-day business of imperialism, going deep back in history, is not conquest, it's working with local military factions in order to get your own business done, to delegate through locals and bring them into your system. And the Marines, Army Special Forces, Green Berets, that's what they do most of the time. They do it very well, but they don't do it as well as the Iranians have done it, with their militias in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. So there's a particular cultural genius to the way that the Iranians operate in the Middle East. The Saudis promised victory in Yemen in 2 months in 2015, and they're really bogged down there. The Saudis promised a quick knockout punch with Qatar over a year ago. They never got it. Yes, a lot of it is due to the impetuosity of the crown prince, but again, Saudi Arabia is a country with no imperial tradition. No real history to draw upon in terms of projecting power, and especially military power in this way. So we have a process of China and Iran, overlaying Eurasia. We have a post-imperial world in the Middle East. And what about the United States at the end of the day? All right, very quickly, the United States is a naval power. That's what it is. That's who we are. Why do I say that? Because there's a moral taboo against using nuclear weapons. So the fact that we have a nuclear arsenal may be necessary, but it doesn't help us on a day-to-day basis. And as far as land forces go, and I'm talking about hard power here, in terms of land forces, you move 15 or 20,000 U.S. Army or Marines from one part of the world to another, or from the United States outside the United States, that's front page news, it's an editorial in the New York Times, it's argument among columnists. But you move an aircraft carrier strike group, which can incinerate several big cities with the firepower it has on it, which has thousands of sailors. You move that aircraft carrier strike group from one part of the world to another, and it's public knowledge, there's nothing secret about it, no news, nobody cares. Maybe a page 5 story somewhere for naval wonks, kind of. And this is why the Navy is such a powerful instrument, because you can do things with it. You can signal, you can move troops around, you can suddenly move 3 carrier battle groups off the Korean Peninsula, whereas 3 weeks before you had only 1. And it's basically, it's not a sexy news story in any way. So we're a naval power. And naval power throughout history is generally been organized around free trade and advancing some form of civil society. Land powers tend to be more conservative. America, everyone says America's like Rome, it's like Rome. It's more like Venice. We're much more like imperial Venice in that respect. So that's what we are. That's our brand. We're a naval power which supports free trade. With our warships, we keep the sea lines of communication open, the choke points open, and access to hydrocarbons for our allies open. And it's a benign influence, and it goes with promoting, not forcibly imposing democracy, but supporting the gradual expansion of civil society. But if you play around with that American brand, you have nothing, essentially. You stop supporting free trade in the general sense. You send out signals that you're not especially interested in advancing the march of civil society. You lose everything, in a way. And you especially lose, and here I'll conclude, in Eurasia, because we're not in Eurasia. We can't have a Belt and Road to compete with China in Eurasia. So what we offer Eurasia is a vision of trade, of civil society, of rule of law, and that's a very attractive vision, especially coming from a country a half a world away that has no territorial ambitions on Eurasia. Makes it very attractive. But this is hard to do when you voluntarily give up or seriously weaken the American brand. And I'll end here. Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.